This is Gareth Aden, and it is my pleasure today to be here on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association and its Historical Committee, and on behalf of the Tennessee Bar Foundation to take the oral history of one of Nashville's esteemed attorneys, David Herbert, and a good friend of mine. David, let's begin with your full name.
My full name is David, middle name is Buchanan Herbert.
And what was your birthday, please, sir?
I was born on October 22, 1936.
Tell me, please, where you were born.
Born at down here on Church Street at the hospital there, Baptist Hospital, and that's
where it all began.
That's where it began.
If you don't mind, tell me a little bit about your parents, who they were and what they did.
My father was Thomas Levins Herbert IV, and my mother was Frances Wells. Mother was from South Carolina, and my father was born and raised in Nashville.
What was his occupation?
He went to college out in the West and learned how to be a dairyman, and began to work at a company that my grandfather had bought in the Depression called Jersey Farms Milk Service, and he was a part owner of that until it was sold in the 70s.
Well, everyone that has been living in Nashville for a number of years, as I have, remembers Jersey Farms well.
Good. Well,
tell me about where your family lived when you were growing up, and a little bit about your elementary education.
We lived on Lindbergh Boulevard, or Lindbergh Road, which is just off of Woodlawn Boulevard in middle of Nashville. And it was an interesting location because my grandfather and grandmother lived next door. And my father's two brothers lived in the next two lots. So all the Herberts lived on that portion, that one whole block of Lindbergh. And all the children would get together from time to time, each afternoon mostly, and we would play football or we would play baseball. Neighbor kids would come in, and so Herbert Field, right behind where we lived, that was owned by my father's brothers, was a location where we had football practice, baseball games, all kinds of activities, all during my growth as I went through Woodmont School at over on Estes.
Did you have brothers or sisters?
I had two brothers.
Tell me about them.
My next brother, Edward, he's 3 years younger than I am, and he's been in the real estate business, investment type structures for people that wanted to buy and invest in real estate. My brother Larry was an accountant, and he worked for Bill Pereira for a number of years, and then went to divinity school and became a pastor, and that's what he's been doing for the last about 15 years. He's a pastor up in Springfield, Tennessee.
I was going to ask you if he, and Edward lives here in Nashville?
Edward lives here in Nashville, over on Woodmont.
And you attended Woodmont Elementary.
That's right.
Did you attend school with any folks who eventually became lawyers here in the bar?
At Woodmont?
Yes, at Woodmont.
I don't think I could tell you of any that I just hadn't thought about my old Woodmont classmates, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
I do remember some of the teachers, but I don't remember many of the, and I'm sure that there were.
Right.
I'm sure that there were several people that would have gone on to much higher elevation. But I can't name them, I'm sorry.
Right. How about high school?
Montgomery Bell Academy.
And how did you like that?
Oh, that was an interesting educational experience. We had a good time. Of course, I could walk to school, which was fun. I was there as a freshman and graduated in 54.
Who was the headmaster while you were there?
Headmaster was Mr. Can't think of his first name, Sager.
Dr. Sager.
Dr. Sager, yes.
Right.
You may know him.
Well, he was the headmaster the first year that I went to MBA, a little bit after you.
Yeah.
And I think he taught math at the time.
He did, and his wife taught Spanish.
Very good. How were your grades in high school?
I was middle of the class. I worked as hard as I thought I needed to, and then athletics were fun. Social life was got to be probably more of my interest than it should have been, but that's the way things went for kids, I guess, in that era. And of course, we had some really smart guys that were there.
Did you play any sports at MBA?
I was on the football team. I guess my highest and most effort and fun was playing against Isaac Litton. And
that was always a big game.
We had a not a very good team and a not a very good coach, but we lost that game 60-0.
No.
And I remember the one reason I remember that so well is that George Volkert, who has been a really esteemed member of this community in the past and has made a lot of contributions, was a friend of mine after that meeting. He picked me up 3 times because I played defensive end and had to guard against 3 guys that ended up in pro football. When they would pull out and make a run at the end, and George Volkert would be following them, running tailback or halfback, and I'd have to take out this pro-style defense as a defensive end. They were in there over 200 pounds, and I was about 140.
That's not exactly fair.
No.
Other than George, who went on to play in the pros? Do you remember any of the names?
A guy named Rip Nix was one of them, and the third guy I thought about, but I lost his name. But
so let's say you graduated then from MBA in about 1954.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about what you did after graduation, where you went to school.
I went on to Georgia Tech. I had been accepted to Vanderbilt in engineering school, and so my grades weren't all that bad. So I said, I have been in this town and with these same people that are going to Vanderbilt that I'm going to be going to school for 4 more years, and I think I want something different. So I went down and saw a architect down here on 2nd Avenue. I can't remember his name. But anyway, I asked him to sign my letter of application to Georgia Tech. I sent it in on a Friday, and the next Friday came back an acceptance. So that turned me around and headed me to Atlanta.
That's a fascinating story. I take it that your desire was to get into engineering?
Engineering school, yes.
Sometime.
I was accepted to engineering at Vanderbilt, and then this was engineering, of course, at Georgia Tech.
Tell us a little bit about Georgia Tech, how you did, and how things went.
When I got down there, got into my dormitory room, and as I was talking just a minute ago, one of the guys that I was able to find and talk to and meet and sit down with was George Volkert. And George was playing halfback for Georgia Tech and was an All-American at one point. So that was my getting into a friendly sight in a new place. And so we enjoyed that for 4 years. I was Phi Delta Theta,
okay,
which was a fraternity that I had wanted to join because my father was a Phi Delta Theta at Iowa State, and a lot of his brothers were the same in their college work. So I just met lots of good guys in that, and of course at that point Georgia Tech had 4 women.
Really?
In the entire school, and the rest of it was male.
How much has that changed today?
Oh, it's 50-50 easy.
Really?
it may be more female than it is male. I haven't checked on it lately, but I could bet it was 50-50 as a minimum.
Well, what did a fella do for a date?
Well, there was an awful lot of good-looking high school girls that we all got to know pretty quick as freshmen, because there were a lot of Atlanta boys in the fraternity, and one of them turned out to be my best friend, who continues to be so today. We have followed each other's life.
Is that your good friend that you go and play golf with regularly during
Absolutely.
the year?
His name is John Smith, John E. Smith II.
Right.
Was from a fine Atlanta family, and has been just a real blessing to me.
David, if I recall correctly, if you began in about 1954, you would have approached graduation in about the spring of '58
Yes,
at Georgia Tech.
That's right, June of '58.
Had you made any plans as you were getting ready to graduate about what you would do after college?
I'm afraid those plans were being made fairly regularly. I went through Air Force ROTC. Was another thing I wanted at Georgia Tech that Vanderbilt didn't have. Didn't have the Air Force ROTC. I was military and air oriented. And so when I graduated, I was commissioned second lieutenant, and then was ordered to go to Scott Air Force Base in St. Louis for training. The training was going to be college graduate work in meteorology, and the Air Force was going to send me there. The other plans that were being made is that my fiancée came down and pinned my bars on, and we were going to get married in September. The Air Force says, no, you're going to be in the Air Force in September. I said, okay, well, we'll get married in August. So we got married in August, loaded our car, and drove to St. Louis.
Wow.
And I started going to school at St. Louis University Institute of Technology, which was a great experience.
Now, we'll come back to this, but since you mentioned it, your wife, Dana, what was her maiden name?
She was Dana. She was Betty Dana Hunley.
Okay.
Was her name.
Where had you met her?
I met her on the front steps of the Phi Delta Theta House at Georgia Tech.
Was she an Atlanta girl?
No, she was from Culpeper, Virginia. And she was going to Agnes Scott.
Okay.
And one of my fraternity brothers had met her and was dating her and brought her over to the fraternity house. And I think I was a junior by then.
All right.
And I saw her sitting in his convertible down in the front of the fraternity house, and I said, I got to know this person.
That's wonderful. So your honeymoon was a driving up to St. Louis for meteorological school.
to go to St. Louis, to St. Louis University.
How long did you study the weather there?
It was a year program.
Very interesting. What was this working toward? Was it some type of job with the Air Force in weather
Right.
prediction?
I would be a weather forecaster and briefer for Air Force operations. And I had no idea where I was going to be sent after school, but we were all knew that the Air Force was going to reassign us to various bases to where we would then become active as forecasters.
How long did the school last? A year?
Yeah, it was a year.
So in about, I guess, 1959, were you assigned to a location?
I was, yes.
Where was that? Tell us about that.
Yeah, we were permitted to make 1, 2, 3 choices, and I put in, my first choice was England. I wanted to go to England and forecast over in the European area, and I don't remember what my other 2 choices were, but when my orders came down, it says, you have been assigned to England, Air Force Base, Louisiana.
Oh, no.
So I was given a sort of a takedown, I guess you'd call it, but that's where we went.
Is that near is that near New Orleans? Or?
It's in Alexandria, Louisiana, and it's right in the middle of the state.
Okay.
It's the dividing line. They say the Rapides River runs east and west through Alexandria, and to the south are Catholics, and to the north are the Baptists. And it's almost, you could just about tell it because of the churches that are there and the people that you meet. And it was really sort of interesting.
That's
at that time.
fascinating.
They weren't in any kind of war, but it just seemed to the Catholics like the south near New Orleans, and the Baptists like the north near.
Well, I know you're an Episcopalian now. What were you at that time? Were you raised in the Episcopal Church?
No, I was raised in the Methodist Church. Mother and Mother and Daddy were Methodists, and they, of course, got us, my three brothers, to West End Methodist Church until I was, I guess, a senior. When I was a senior, I was in charge of the young adults, or the young, the young students' Sunday school. And I would do the Sunday school class at West End Methodist Church. And then when I finished that, I'd get on the bus and ride out to St. George's Church and meet my girlfriend.
Oh, I see.
And enjoy the services there. So I got pretty well acclimated to the Episcopal Church at that point. Then I joined, and when I went to Atlanta, to Georgia Tech, and was a participant in the activities at the local church there, and was president of the EYC.
Well, what good fortune for the Episcopal Church. Then.
And of course, then Dana was an Episcopalian, and she was coming to those services too from Agnes Scott. Right. And she could come to those services and attend the evening program, and it wasn't counted as a date. Mm. So we would meet, and then I would take her and some of the other girls back to Agnes Scott after the meeting.
Praise the Lord.
Yes, I tell you, it was a spiritual benefit.
Tell us about your stay in Louisiana at the Air Force Base.
We got down there in the summer of '59. We had our first child while we were at St. Louis, and so the three of us hunted for a place to stay, and we found a farm that had workers' quarters that had been vacated but had been somewhat fixed up for rental. And we moved into one of these, just a worker's house that had a bedroom and a kitchen and a living area and a metal roof.
How about that?
And that's where we lived for about 6 months.
Yeah.
I say the metal roof because when Louisiana would have a storm, this was in a pecan grove, and the pecans would be knocked out of the tree and would rain down on that metal roof. And it just, it's something that sticks with you.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. After 6 months, did you get reassigned to another location?
No, we stayed there for 2 years.
Okay. You just moved to another
We
spot.
moved to another home finally, because that wasn't a place for Dana to be left. While I was working shift work. In other words, I'd work days, 2 days, then two swings, and then 2 mids, and off 2 days, and then start that process over again. So if I'm going from midnight till 8 in the morning, she's out there in the field in this house, with a baby.
Sure.
Yeah.
I understand. Let's see, you would then, at about 1961, were you discharged from your duties at the Air Force?
Yes, we were. I left on the 1st of August of '61, and my cohorts there were saying, "You can't get out." I said, "Why?" He says, "Because the Berlin Wall just went up, and we're going to have some fun. You're going to have to stay." I said, "No, I am gone." So I did get out, but I just remember that as being the day, or right about the day the Berlin Wall went up. Now we talk about it coming down, but that's when it went up.
How about that? Did you come back to Nashville?
Yes, we came back to Nashville. Now that we were 4 at that time. So my son Tom was born in the Air Force Hospital down there in Alexandria, and so I have 2 military kids.
And what was your daughter's name? I didn't ask you.
Oh,
about
daughter
that.
was Ann Teresa's her name. We call her, and I've always called her Tracy.
Tracy. Okay.
She's a real estate agent here in Nashville, and just works really hard.
When you got back to Nashville, what did you decide to do?
Well, I was on a tear as to whether or not to extend my enlistment and become a regular officer in the Air Force and hopefully get sent back to school. So I wanted to do hurricane searching. Fly those C-130s and drop soundies down and find out what's going on in the atmosphere. There's a real chance for that. And then my father's partner called me on the phone. He says, "We want you to come back here and go to work at Jersey Farms." So that was an offer I could not turn down.
Right.
So we came back to go to work at the company.
And how long did you work at Jersey Farms?
I worked there until 68, January 1, 68, and that's when I started practicing law.
David, tell us a little bit about what you did at Jersey Farms before you decided to go to law school.
I was, first of all, assistant plant manager, and I would help determine the amount of milk that was going to be bottled that day, how much to put in what size cartons, and what the production was supposed to be. Watching after we were still running bottles at that time. We had a bottle washer, and we had to be sure that the bottles were being properly cleaned and then protected until they were filled. We were buying machinery, had to be sure that the kind of machinery we were buying, the speeds that it would run, and how much production we could get, and that sort of thing. Was watching the cooler section. We had a huge cooler with hold the inventory.
Right.
And then that would be loaded out into trucks during late night and early in the morning, and then, of course, the trucks would go out and make their deliveries.
Well, Jersey Farms was prominent in the Nashville milk market, as I recall.
Yes, we were probably third in terms of size, with Purity a little bigger than us, and then Seal Test was a national distributor.
Right.
They had a pretty good section of the market.
And besides yourself, and I guess was it your uncle that called you, or your father?
My father's partner.
Okay.
There was no relationship between the two of them, and so
Okay.
that had evolved from my grandfather.
Right. As you were working for Jersey Farms, whatever brought the question of law school to your mind?
Well, working for Jersey Farms, one of the things that did give me some indication that I needed to do some more study was that I was beginning to get involved in the union business. We had a union, and my father hated them, which is no secret.
You're not telling a family secret.
No. And so I was having to kind of deal with him and with the union in order to keep things as much on even keel as possible. And then I dealt with a couple of strikes. Had to sit up 2 or 3 nights in a row trying to resolve a strike. So I'm thinking, if I'm going to take over this company, I need to know more about what's going on in the world. And I'm not doing anything much now except what I'm doing at the office. So I've got time to start studying. That might be a good idea. Well, at the time, also, I had joined the Tennessee Air Guard when I came back as a reserve officer. And I was working as a forecaster out at Berry Field. And we had, I think, 2 other officers and a clerk typist.
Right.
The clerk typist was going to the Nashville School of Law, or the YMCA night law school at that time.
Right.
And I was talking to him about, well, I'm not doing anything. What do you do? And he was telling me about what you did, go at night and study. And he said it was quite fulfilling, and he was really interested in it. And so said, well, I think I'll try that out. And so, of course, it had a VA benefit, and so that was helpful.
That helped you cover the cost.
Yes. So I went ahead and signed up. And so he graduated, passed the bar. I graduated and passed the bar, and I'm not sure the fourth or fifth lawsuit we had was against each other. That's Tommy Carlton.
Oh, yes.
So Tommy Carlton is the guy that got me in law school.
How about that? In your period that you were in law school, when was that? That is, what were the dates?
I started in 64.
Okay.
And I guess actually it was probably late 63. And it's a 4-year course, but I dropped out for about 6 months because my Jersey Farms work went into sales, and I was having to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work with our retail sales force. So I just stayed on and did moot court and then finished up the next year. So I guess I was really 4.5 years, graduated in 67.
Where was the YMCA Law School, as it used to be known, located at that time?
Yeah, it of course, it's not there now. There's nothing there. There's a hotel there now.
Right.
It's on the corner of 7th and Union.
Right.
Right across from the old YMCA, which the female YMCA
Exactly.
was on 7th.
Who was the dean of the law school? Was it Dean Lackey at that time?
I think Dean Lackey was the dean, yes. Chris Hoff was the secretary.
Okay.
And he was helping me with all of the VA stuff, and he was keeping the record of the payments and stuff. But Lackey was the I said Lackey. What's his first name?
Joe Lackey.
No, not Joe.
Maybe it was James. I'm not sure myself,
I'm not
but
either.
Dean Lackey was the name that
Yes.
I always remembered.
Yeah.
What size school was it at that time, David?
I think we probably had 500, 600 students in all the classes. I think we started off with about 100, and I imagine the other classes were similar in size for 4 years, so that's 400 or 500 students. Now, and of course, we just had one group going through, regular academic schedule, and we'd probably start with about 500 and end up with about 300.
Right. Right. So there's going to be some attrition.
Oh, there was some attrition. Yeah, I had my evidence professor said, any of you guys that are still sitting here after Christmas have a good chance of being on the Supreme Court.
Tell me about some of your professors that you remember from the school back in those days. Anybody else? Or people you went to school with, other than Tom Carlton?
Okay. Of course, I was in two different classes. My first class, of course, I dropped out of and then came back into the later class. And they all accused me of doing that, so I'd be the top student in my second class. Because the first class, this girl had run away with it. So, and I was trying to think the other day about some of the professors that we had, but the names are just not.
Was Harlan Dodson a professor at that time?
Now, he was one that I was trying to remember particularly because he would teach us ethics.
Yeah.
And didn't any other, I don't think Vanderbilt or anybody else had ethics classes, but we did, and we did it for about 3 months, I guess. And
right.
He showed us how to mishandle a witness. And he got out there to be the lawyer, and we were all sitting up there watching him, and he was asking us questions, and he mishandled us in ways that I just have not forgotten. And he had eyes that were just as steely as they could be, and he bore down on us on these questions, and we all got a good idea of what to do and what not to do, but how to do it and get away with it.
I'm trying to think of some other folks But you might, was John Lentz in your class or one of your classes?
John was in Vanderbilt
What
at
about,
the same time I was.
was Jim Dale a professor there?
Jim Dale lived, yes. He did business.
Yeah.
Business. Corporations, I guess, and business arrangements. And he liked me because I was secretary of a corporation. I thought, woo.
Impressive.
He did. I got an A.
I take it your grades were good.
I got all A's except one B, and
Gosh, who did that to you?
the dean.
Oh my. Well, when it came time to graduate, you would be at about 1968.
It would have been late 67.
Okay.
But it was August of 67, I think, when we got our license. So that was after graduation and after the bar exam.
Well, everybody, I'm sure, asked you this question, but how did you study for the bar?
I had started preparing, I guess, halfway through the law school. And the way I did it was that's when the Southwest Reporter came out with the advance sheets.
Right.
And they were the little pamphlets, little green pamphlets with 4 states in it: Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, I think. And I'd take the Tennessee cases and cut them out with a razor. And I'd take those cases and I'd file them in a big file folder that I had. And I'd put anything that dealt with torts in this one, and contracts in here, criminal law in here, and I just kept accumulating those cases. And then when we got ready to study for the bar, I got them out, and then I went through and analyzed as many as I could. And then we had a study group. And my study group was 3 Vanderbilt boys and me. We didn't go through one of these expensive 3-month-long preparation. We did it ourselves. We had some old exams, which was okay.
Sure.
And then I had all these cases. And we would go over the old exams, and then I'd show them where those cases were in the Southwest Reporter. I just hand them to them. Here's what they said.
Well, David, you were in the position to be the Don Payne. If you'd followed up on that, yeah. You could have taught the bar review course. That's amazing.
We did, yeah. Your partner, John Lentz, was in that group, and John and I have talked about that, those evenings that we spent together over in the Judson Harwood was
right.
Was across the street neighbor, and we would study in his attic.
Where were you living with Miss Dana and your family at that time?
That was on Carden Avenue, just off of West End.
Right. So you passed the bar and were admitted to practice in late 67,
August
early
of
67.
67.
Okay.
I have a very unusual law license. My law license says that it was granted to me in August 7th, blank. They forgot to put the year in my license, so I've just kept it as a souvenir of Tennessee's ability to do things, so it saves me when I miss something like that. I said, look, Supreme Court missed this too.
Did you have any question about whether or not you wanted to practice law? I know you were still working, I guess, for Jersey Farms.
Yeah, I was. At that time, there was a lot going on. I had been chairman of the Clinic Bowl. I don't know whether you remember the Clinic Bowl or not.
I do.
But it was a high school championship football game that we used to raise money for Vanderbilt's physical therapy. No, physical therapy people.
Okay.
Because see strong legs run, so weak legs. And so we were working real hard on that. At the same time, I was studying for the bar and doing all this other stuff. And I was going to be president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce the next year. So there's a lot of things going on in that time period. And so I thought about it, got down into October and November, and I'm thinking, I've just passed a bar exam. That is probably the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm going to know more about the law now than I'm ever going to know. So why wait 3 or 4 years and make the decision? So I told my dad that I'm sorry, I'm leaving. I'm going to practice law.
How did he take that?
He said he loved it. He said, I wanted you out of this business and in a professional ever since you went to Georgia Tech.
Well, that's wonderful.
And so that was a great boost.
I'm sure it was. Where did you sort of decide to hang out your shingle?
What I did was, in thinking about all this, I said, well, you know, I don't know many lawyers, and I don't have any idea how lawyers make money. But it's something that I know now that I can do, and I'm going to do it. So my only real contact was a friend that I'd been going to church with for years, and we played bridge with him and his wife, and his name was Tommy Smith.
Right.
Thomas O.H.
Right.
Smith, Jr. So I said, I'm going to call Tommy and see what he thinks. So I called him, and he said, well, y'all, come on down here. Let me talk to you. So I came down, met him and Bill Ortale, and the next week they made me an offer, and I said, why fool with it anymore? Well, this is what I want.
This begins it.
Yeah, so that did it.
And that was, I guess, your introduction to Bill Ortale, who became very prominent in your life.
He sure did. That was when I really met him. I met him when I was in law school. I was summoned to the jury, and I sat on the jury over here on a number of cases, and it was a lot of fun. What kind of experience is that for a law student to get to sit on the jury and go back in the jury room, you know, and go through all of that stuff that you try to figure out what's going on in later years. I sat on a case that Bill was trying. And so I saw him, and I almost can remember Don Smith was on the other side.
I hope that you ruled for Bill Ortale.
Oh, Ortale won.
Okay. Very good.
But I had already talked to Tommy. I think I talked to him before then. Well, anyway, I saw Tommy in the courthouse after that, and he said, well, I see you ruled in favor of my partner. Sure did.
Let's see, it was Smith.
I almost remember the facts of the case.
Was it Smith, Ortale, and Smith?
No, at that time, yes, it was Smith, Ortale, and Smith.
Right. And
his father, Tommy Smith's father, in his 80s, was still cranking along real hard.
Very good.
Bill was in the middle.
Yep.
And I think that eventually surfaced as the problem that broke him up. That he couldn't work with the two of them.
Right. David, what type of practice did you develop during the first year or so?
Well, they were doing a lot of workers' compensation work at that time, and doing insurance defense work. Bill Ortale was strong. He just left, or not just left, but he had been with State Farm as an adjuster, and State Farm really liked him and were really being favorable to us, I think, or to him. So I was handling most of what he had in terms of maybe subrogation work.
Right.
Was the way what I was learning on as much as anything.
And back in those days, the bar wasn't nearly as large as it is now.
No, I think at that point I felt like I was down at the bottom of a funnel, and all these people were above me and were funneling stuff down. But it didn't take long. The lawyers were so cordial and so full of camaraderie and working together, and we'd fight like mad, but not personally.
Right.
And so that continued to help develop us young guys, because I felt like after about 3 or 4 years, I knew almost everybody.
I remember that same feeling. I began at the bar a couple of years, or 3 maybe after you did, but the same thing. You almost feel for a while that you can know everybody because the bar's not that large.
That's
at
right.
that time. How long did you stay with Tommy Smith and Bill Ortale and Tommy's dad?
I started in January of '68, and in June of '70 it split.
And where did you go?
And I went down to the 9th floor. We were the first tenants on the 14th floor of the old the new Third National Bank building.
Yes.
Yes. That is now something else. I'm not sure what they call it now, but over on corner of 4th and Church.
Right.
Okay. And when we broke up, Bill was able to get some space on the 9th floor, so we just moved down to the 9th floor and left Tommy and his dad on the 14th.
And what was the name of that new firm?
That was Ortale, Herbert, and Crawford. And I have the partnership agreement in there in my desk. So
How about that?
June of 1970. June of 1970. Then in April of 1971, we had a great thing happen. And that's when Bill and John Kelley, fabulous lawyer John Kelley, got together and decided that John Kelley couldn't put up with the hookers anymore. And this guy named Aiden down there in this law firm, and that he was going to come and join us. And that started Ortale, Kelley, Herbert, and Crawford.
And
April.
That was in 1971?
71.
Wow.
And we've been that way since then.
And how many lawyers were in the firm at that time? 4 or 5?
Well, it was Bill and John, and then Billy Crawford, me, and Pete Cantrell. No, Pete didn't come with us.
Okay.
And I think it was just the 4 of us.
Right. And today, how many lawyers at Ortale Kelley?
We've been as high as 23.
Gee, it's a great story.
Yeah, well, thank you.
It
It's
really
been
is.
fun living it, I tell you.
How did your firm practice and your own practice develop then in the early 70s? Tell us about that.
Well, of course, Mr. Smith was an interesting person to be with. He had all kinds of interesting claims, I guess you'd say. And he had me in every court in Middle Tennessee, federal court, Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court. I mean, he had all this stuff, and he would call me up and he said, listen, I've got this paternity case tomorrow before the Court of Appeals, and the brief is in my file drawer. If you would get that out and go up and argue it for me, I'd appreciate it.
Heavens, Betsy.
And that happened several times. So you've got to go to the General Sessions and try this case. Here's the file. It's tomorrow. Well, that was a real learning experience because I got to know people. I go and ask, what do I do? Where go to the clerks, and the clerks were just so nice to help you get to the right spot and do what needed to be done. Well, that's kind of got me started on juicing getting the juices going about litigation. And so we went on with Bill and the various cases that he had. So we were essentially an insurance defense firm. So that's what I did for, I guess, at least 3 years, just trying case after case after case. Well, it was just a lot of fun. And then I had some friends who were owning real estate companies, and they wanted me to do real estate transactions. I don't know what you're talking about. So we sat down and talked about that for a while, and so I moved into the real estate closing business as much as anything. And so we ran that for, that began then that pretty good section of my practice. So I was doing about 2/3 real estate closing and 1/3 litigation.
Right.
And that continued for a long time. So I guess the last time I had any serious litigation was in probably early '90. So that went on for those 10 years.
And I presume you practiced in almost every court in Middle Tennessee during that period.
In every county.
In every county.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And doing that was another thing that was very satisfying, and that is that you'd get to know lawyers in these other counties sitting in the courtroom waiting for your case to come up, and you sit there and chat with them, or what do you do, and you know, who you with, oh, who's that guy over there, and you would, it spread out your knowledge of people, lawyers, which is one of the reasons I wanted to be a lawyer, because I wanted to be with lawyers. And I was.
That's wonderful. How about the firm? Did the firm begin taking on additional clientele and lawyers as you got into the late 70s and the early 80s?
Yeah, Bill was the major, I guess, chief. We called him the chief. And we would find out that we had a new associate from time to time. And of course, we were partners. Bill and I were partners from the beginning, but it was his decision on who to hire and when to hire them. And then as he would build this insurance practice, Billy Crawford did real well in the insurance practice, and he had some friends that were in contact with other insurance people who needed good lawyers, and so Billy's practice really grew till he was working himself really hard, and he had 3 or 4 of the associates working with him. So we grew to probably, in the first 10, 12 years, to about the principals, Ortale, Kelley, Herbert, Crawford, and then about 8 others at the most. We had Courts came with us.
Tom Courts?
Tom Courts came with us. Doug Brace came with us.
Right. I remember Doug had come also. But Doug wasn't so much in litigation, was he?
No, he came in pretty much as helping me in real estate, but he did some collection work.
Okay.
And he was a mean lawyer. He didn't put up with any excuses, which really benefited him in a lot of ways, I think, with the clients that he was able to develop.
Absolutely. And as you got into the 90s and then the 2000s, did your practice more center on the real estate end of things?
My practice did. I had, and then it didn't go 100% ever. I had some corporate clients. I had one particular corporate client. We bought 6 radio stations from around the United States. We bought them, and then that generated a couple of other clients that bought and sold real estate, bought and sold radio stations, AM and FM radio stations, and it was really an interesting go, and working with lawyers in New York, lawyers in New Orleans, lawyers in Atlanta, lawyers in Birmingham. I mean, it was really an interesting period of time, but unfortunately, he ran out of money before I got completely compensated. So, in one closing in New York, he said, "Now, David, this buyer wants to give us a gift, and I've got you a set of cowboy boots. So I've got some snake skin cowboy boots that are worth at least $80,000.
You haven't practiced law till that's happened. I mean, really, you know. Oh, that's wonderful.
But unfortunately, he's now deceased, and the company that he was putting together just ran out of money. The advertisers, for about, I guess, 6 or 7 months, just kept stopping advertising. I think they were all getting ready for a presidential race.
Right.
And so they were not spending any money on regular advertising. So anyway, it really hurt him. And so he was pretty well leveraged anyway.
You know, I was very fond, as I know everyone in your office is, of Bill Ortale. What was he like to practice with for so many years?
Well, he was the just an extremely deeply caring individual for his people.
Yeah.
And he could really get angry at somebody who was not treating us right, and protect us from all kinds of adversaries that would come across. I had one situation where I had a problem with a business sale closing, and the seller was getting a little hot at me, and Ortale sat down to represent me, and they said, "Well, we're going to sue you," and I said, "Fine." He said, "But you can sign this covenant not to toll the statute of limitations." I said, "Let me go to my lawyer," and I went to Bill. I said, "Bill, they're going to sue us, or we can sign this waiver statute." He said, "Tell them to sue us." And they never did.
Sounds like Harlan Dodson.
Yes. But but Bill was, of course, he was always thinking about how to improve the situation of the firm, and the firm was just his first interest. It's not how much money he was making or we were making; it was how well we were doing.
Right.
And that was just his primary concern all the time.
I should have asked you this earlier, but where did you move your offices from the Third National Bank building at some point? I know you did.
We moved back to the 14th floor.
Okay. And then
I think it was about 86, 87, we moved over to the offices in the Noel Place.
Right. And you were there for, gosh, what?
How long is that?
15
years?
I don't know. Well, 87, 90. You were there, over 20 years.
Yeah.
And your office is just recently
We just recently moved.
And
moved in March of this year,
right.
2014.
Right. Let's, if I could, go back for just a minute and talk about something that I know is very important to you, and that's your family. And I know that you've told us about your wife, Dana, and how you met, and at least two of your children. You and Dana had more than?
Yeah, I didn't tell you. I told you that I had two when we moved
right.
Back to Nashville after the Air Force. But my son was born at the England Air Force Base Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
Tommy, in January of '61.
What's Tommy doing now?
Tommy's a stockbroker, or I guess the more accurate term is a financial advisor, licensed financial advisor. That's different from a stockbroker, I think. It's probably, it takes in more of a financial planning than just a stockbroker, because he doesn't just handle stock, he handles trusts and taxes.
Is he living here in Nashville also?
He and his wife and two children live on Shies Hill Road off of Harding Place, yes.
That makes it great as a grandparent to have your grandchildren right here in town.
Well, and then I have my daughter was born after we started at Jersey Farms, and she was born in December of '67.
And what's her name?
Mary Catherine.
Okay.
And Mary Catherine now lives in Signal Mountain, is in the Hamilton County school system. She teaches and has one daughter.
How many grandchildren do you have total?
5.
Wonderful.
Tommy has 2, Emily and Allie, mm-hmm. And Tracy has 2, Francis and Clay, and then Abby Grace is Catherine's daughter.
And I know that you live there on Hampton. When did you and the family move to Hampton?
We just a little bit earlier than that. We bought a house on Carton Avenue that we mentioned a minute ago, and I don't know whether I said it or not, but George Volkert was our realtor.
Isn't that something? He keeps popping up in your life.
I just was so crazy about him. That must have brought him forth to help us. But anyway, he was our realtor. In '73, we bought a house on Hampton, and did some work on it. And then 2 years later, we added on a wing to the back of the house.
Right.
And then it's been that way since it's a 70s house.
That's probably the best investment you ever made.
Well, it's the best investment my wife ever made, because I wouldn't have bought it.
I know what you're saying. David, you know, tell us a little bit about the civic activities you've been in. I had no idea, for instance, that you had been the chairman of the Clinic Bowl. Yeah. What other things in town?
Yeah, I was John Sloan. I don't know whether you remember John Sloan or
yes.
not. Yeah, John was at First American Bank, and he and I had been friends since MBA, and we were both named co-chair of that Clinic Bowl in '67. And then in '69, I was president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, which not a JC organization. It was right. a local junior chamber. We were affiliated with the Nashville Senior Chamber.
Right.
Just a side to that, earlier in my father's life, he was president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And later, after I was president, my son Tommy was president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce.
That's a great story.
But then other civic, of course, I was in the Tennessee Air Guard.
Okay.
My uncle, now deceased, Enoch Stevenson, was a brigadier general, and he was commander of the wing. And he asked me to, he said, "You're going to come on and get in the Guard, aren't you?" And, I mean, that was not a rhetorical question.
You were going to become a member of the Guard.
So, yes, sir, General.
Yes, sir.
And out we went, and then, of course, I told you about Tommy Carlton and all of that silly stuff. I don't think that my church work hadn't started then. I was on the vestry at St. George's Church a couple of times, and senior warden a couple of times. And
let's see now, you also have been an officer, I think, of the Nashville Bar Association.
Yes, I think that was. I had two really good mentors back in the early '80s. One was John Kelley, right. and John was directing me to more of an involvement in things that I just probably would not have pursued, but he thought I was right for it. And had he lived, and of course John died in '85, which just broke our hearts. But he was president of the bar. Yes. And we ran the Bar Association out of his office, he and his secretary, and that was it.
Yeah, long time ago.
Long time ago. And he's the one that started the magazine. That's the magazine now. It was just a little newspaper or a little two-sheet news for what the Bar Association was doing.
I had forgotten that, but that's right. Yeah. He started the Nashville Bar Journal.
Right, and so we would work on that, and then, of course, he had no support in disciplinary matters, and these complaints would come in, and we'd have to, I represented the bar, I don't know, it was the Tennessee bar. That the Tennessee bar would get the Nashville bar to help them handle disciplinary problems. And so, I mean, we were doing that. It was interesting, but that really that brought the Bar Association really close to us. And then, and what I was getting to as a result of that, I was nominated for the bar and then was elected. And in the third year, I luckily missed out on getting to name president like you did. Like you didn't, you got named. But I didn't. I was first vice president.
Right. Right.
And served that third year in that capacity.
You've been also very active, I think, for many years in what used to be the Exchange Club and is now the Economic Club of Nashville.
That's
right?
Correct. I joined that. One of the first things I did when I got back in 1961.
And did you serve as the president of the Exchange?
I was president of that in '86, '87.
David, just another aspect of your citizenship in not only the bar but in Nashville. You have done a lot of work for St. George's and for the diocese. Tell us how that developed.
Of course, I was, like I said, was quite active when I came back in '61, and we had, I think, two of our children were baptized there, and I then began to, you do Sunday school, you do this, you make yourself really well known, and then when you're well known, they start asking you to do this, that, and the other. Well, anyway, I ran for the vestry, which is the board of directors, and was elected to that. And then a couple of years later, while serving, I was named the senior warden.
Right.
Then went off a couple of years later, back on, elected senior warden again, went off a couple of years later, back on.
You're kidding. Have you
was,
served 3 terms
I think
as
3
senior
terms,
warden?
Yeah. And no, the third term I was junior warden.
Okay. Well, that's even a worse job.
Yes.
That's a hard job.
With George Langstaff. I don't know whether you know George Langstaff or not. He was senior warden my last go at it.
Right.
And so one of the lawyers there that I got to know real well was named Lewis Farrell. And Lewis was a sole practitioner most of the time.
Right.
He was the kind of lawyer that had his own idea about what should be done about any particular lawsuit or case that he had, and he had several lawyers that came in and worked with him for a while, but he generally was a sole practitioner. And Lewis was called the vice chancellor of the diocese, of the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee, which is a corporate position that maintains the legal aspects of the corporation. The Diocese of Tennessee at that time was statewide. West Tennessee had the chancellor, East Tennessee had a vice chancellor, and Middle Tennessee had a vice chancellor. And he asked me to do real estate work for him. So I started helping him do various things, and then ended up, Lewis got sick and had to retire, and then the diocese split into 3 different dioceses, East, Middle, and West, and I was named the chancellor of the Diocese of Tennessee, which we maintain the Tennessee name. East Tennessee is named East Tennessee, West Tennessee is named West Tennessee, but Middle Tennessee is not Middle Tennessee. It's
When did
Tennessee.
you first become vice
I
chancellor?
think it was about 85, 86, somewhere in that way.
And then sometime in
No, that would be chancellor. Vice chancellor would have been in maybe 80.
Gosh, well that's what I thought.
Yeah.
I thought it was earlier than 86, and then you became chancellor sometime in the mid to late 80s.
Mid 80s, yeah.
And remained chancellor, serving under how many bishops?
How many? Bishop Sanders, who I just had a meeting with yesterday, he's still with us. Bishop Herlong, who is now deceased, and now Bishop Bereschmidt.
Right. That's a wonderful service. For those who may be listening later, tell us what a chancellor of the Episcopal Church, what they do.
Each diocese in the structure of the church has a chancellor and then vice chancellors to assist, and they would be like the corporate legal advisor or the corporate legal officer, and they represent the bishop and then the corporate organization, which is in Tennessee is called a bishop and council. In some dioceses it's called the board of directors, and some it's called the council. But anyway, that's how the church then tends to manage its legal affairs.
And when you stepped down as chancellor, I think it was about, 2006 or 7, I believe you were appointed by the diocese as Chancellor Emeritus.
Emeritus, yeah.
And still serve in that capacity.
I hadn't gotten away yet, no, but I had a wonderful replacement that I had no difficulty in agreeing to cease being on the firing line. His name is Mr. Ayton.
Well,
Garrett
thank you.
Ayton.
Thank you. Yeah. David, did you enjoy the work as chancellor and the work you've done with the church?
Yeah, at one time when I was at Georgia Tech and I was president of the college group, Canterbury Club, they called it. I was working closely with priests that were helping us, and I decided, I was thinking that there may be some kind of call here, so I better check it out. So 2 of us got on a plane and flew up to Virginia, to the Virginia Seminary, and spent a couple of days there looking around. And so I was church-oriented, I guess, from that experience. And so I just sort of followed that feeling into work in the church. Whatever they wanted me to do, I would do it. And the more they asked me to do, the happier I was, I guess. And then getting to be then having the responsibility where the bishop is looking down at you saying, look, help me. You know, what do I do in this particular situation? And it was a like I say, it was a spiritual benefit.
Well, I had a feeling for you it was a special opportunity for service, and you certainly have served well. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if you had served actually as on a national group of chancellors that serve the legal end of the church.
Right. That was one of Lewis's beginnings. Lewis Farrell felt like that the chancellors needed a source where they could look at other chancellors' work, briefs and any lawsuits that they'd had, or any letters that they've written, opinions about whether or not this particular canon worked, or the canons or bylaws in this situation. And so he went to Westlaw and met a girl up there named Farrell, and they teamed up, and she helped him set up a door into Westlaw, that you could get into Westlaw, then type in chancellor, and you would go into this place where documents were being sent and filed. And that was really his dream, to get chancellors all over the church able to see what chancellors were doing. It didn't really work too well because it was difficult getting product into the source. And so as time went by, it sort of kind of fell down. Well, I was secretary to the corporation that he and I formed. And as we went forward, then we had some other people who get interested, and so we got more interest, and it sort of held together. And now we have a network where we have a listserv with all the new technology that's come about, where lawyers can write messages to each other on a listserv, and nobody else can get in and see what the lawyers are saying to each other, which is a good way to handle that kind of church business. And we have a law firm that will catalog our documents, and we send those in, and they'll catalog them, and you can get into that catalog and pull up anything that you want and put in anything that you have that is helpful.
Well, it's a magnificent service.
I've served until last year, 2 years ago now, as secretary of that corporation.
I think you've also served the church as an elected deputy from the lay order of the church to General Convention.
I have. The church General Convention is the national churches come together every 3 years. It's a triennium convention. And the laity is represented by what they call deputies, and the deputies are elected by each diocese. And they come and sit and represent their diocese before 4 deputies, and then 4 clergy will sit together and represent their diocese in this convocation. So there's, like 800 people coming together to try to make some decisions. But I've done that 6 times.
6 general conventions.
So it's 18 years of dealing with the national church.
That's a wonderful service. David, this has been fascinating. But before I sort of let you go, a couple of questions. One is, looking back, has practice changed much during the years that you've been a lawyer here in Nashville?
Well, we were talking about that earlier with our videographer here, about what he's dealing with in his technology, and making you think back to 1968 when we had fax machines that ran some kind of strange paper, and we had copies that were onion skin, and you'd type a will with 6 copies, and the secretary would make a mistake, you'd have to throw all that out and start over.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the automatic typewriters came about, and then, of course, the technology is probably the biggest thing that has changed. And then we were talking about, I guess, again, with several lawyers that we were having lunch together, what things had changed. And some of the things that they mentioned were new stuff. But I said, look, in 1970, I think it was, when the new rules came in, and we all had to get busy and figure out what are we talking about, these new rules. And I remember Justice Harbison had a seminar about it in Cancun, and by golly, I went. And we had a good time, and Justice Harbison did a great job in going over those new rules.
Cancun would get you there.
Yeah. Well, not much was going to Cancun in 1970. That was kind of the time that the new hotels had just been built, and it was. But anyway, that was one of the biggest changes. We went from a declaration to a complaint, and an answer to. What did we call that?
Right.
But anyway, that was a big change, and then of course the technology, as I said, is the biggest thing that just keeps changing the practice. And you go over there and watch a lawsuit now, and you see technology being used by the parties. I mean, at will.
Yeah.
And 15 years ago, there was about the only thing you see would maybe be a television screen. I used one, it had been 20 years ago, and took a video of a house that was being poorly built and used that as evidence. But now you go over there, you've got the PowerPoint. They can pull out deposition testimony and put it on the screen in front of the jury. The jury are people that watch television all the time, so this is just right down their alley, and they're picking up on it. I mean, that's amazing changes in the practice. Now, the law itself has thankfully remained pretty constant in terms of what's demanded of the people, and we've seen a lot of changes that are being made in some of our constitutional issues that we probably wouldn't have agreed with 25 years ago, and probably wouldn't have even come up. So that kind of change is also difficult for old lawyers to put up with.
Yeah. Are there any memorable people or memorable cases or events that you wanted to mention as a part of
yes,
your history?
and I started a minute ago, and we didn't get into it, was talked about John Kelley, who came with us in 71 and formed Ortale, Kelley, Herbert, and Crawford. And his mentoring of me and having me do things that I might not have thought about doing myself, but moving me in that direction. And then his friend, and also probably you'd call him a client, but a great lawyer and a member of the Tennessee Air National Guard, and just everything that I thought was also I just really admired was John Toon.
Yes.
And I was thinking, if those two guys had lived, both of them died in the mid-'80s. John Kelley in 85 and John Toon, I think, in 84. If those two guys lived, my life would have been completely different. Even though I loved Ortale and was working with him, those two guys had a lot of influence on my thinking and what I would do. And I really know that that's been a hole that was put into my life at the time those two guys passed away. Lawsuits, I need to tell you about one lawsuit. I was going to tell you about that last lawsuit the big lawsuit that we tried was a several $1 million claim against a lawyer. And we represented the lawyer through his insurance carrier in federal court. And it was a Willie Nelson master that had been sold to these people, and they'd taken this huge tax deduction on it, and the government says this is fraudulent. And my client was a lawyer who had written a tax opinion, who said that it was just fine to do this. And so that brings up another lawyer that I wanted to tell you about, and that is named Mark. I've got Williams and Edwards in my mind, but it's not Mark Westlake.
Yes.
Who is a partner of yours,
Correct.
Mr. Aiden.
Correct.
I knew that he was the best young lawyer in Nashville that knew tax law, and so I hired him as my expert. And he schooled me on what this tax opinion said and how it was appropriate and it was okay. And I used his information to go and cross-examine their expert and take his deposition, and really got some good admissions out of him. And then we were trying the lawsuit, and we were really making hay. Tom Courts was helping me, and Tom is just, I mean, he's a bulldog. He's a shoot from the hip guy, though, I'll tell you. And we had all these exhibits of the contracts that had been entered into, and exhibits of the tax opinion that had been written, and all this stuff would be put up in these. It would have been a great thing to have today with the technology that we have. But we had boards,
right? Court.
And we had one of our associates who would go get the board and put it up in front of the jury, and he would point to what we were talking about. They called him Vanna White. But it was scary though, because there's several $1 million involved, and so I had gone through my discovery work and had found a letter, and the letter said there were some exhibits. Well, I couldn't find the exhibits, so I hunted around on all this stuff that they'd given me, and I found Exhibit 1, I found Exhibit 2, I found down here Exhibit 3. Well, they scattered it out through that darn discovery. But I found it all, one Sunday night when you're getting ready. It's what I told my lawyers, you be ready. And that's what we were working on. We were trying to be ready. And so I had gotten the letter introduced, and I got Exhibit 1 introduced, I got Exhibit 2 introduced, and Exhibit 3 was just a smoking gun. And before I could open my mouth and say, I want you to identify this, crash! There was a huge crash behind me. Tom Courts had fallen over backwards in his chair onto the floor. And I look around, and he's coming up like this. So, he's just right over the top of the table. And he said, I was listening, Judge. Well, that was, we did get through that case, and we won it. The jury went with our guy.
Was that in federal court?
That was in federal court.
Yeah, that's great.
Judge Tom Wiseman.
Mm-hmm.
Had said in our meetings in chambers, he said, this guy is a criminal. He needs to be punished. Well, wait a minute, Judge. Because if it had been a bench trial, we would have been
You would have been sunk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good. That's
But
wonderful.
anyway, that was probably the most fun case. And then 2 weeks later, I get a case of Jack Daniels.
You deserved it.
From our lawyer friend. So that was probably a thing that you're just going to always remember. There were lots of other cases, of course, but yeah. And that guy probably didn't deserve our hard work as much as he got, but he did. And there are other people that you tried cases for that really deserved the work that you did for them, and it's just more fun to have an appreciative client that writes you a note, tells you that you really did make their day or something like that. And then I had one note read by the pro bono people to the Nashville Bar meeting. Do you remember that?
I do. That was quite a note, too.
That was something.
And that really makes you feel good.
Yes, it does. Well, you have a lot of satisfaction in that sort of thing.
Well, I want to thank you on behalf of the bar for taking the time to share your history and the things that you've done and contributed. It's really been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those comments. I've enjoyed it. I tell you, thinking back about all that stuff, I hadn't thought about it in a long time. So
Yeah.
I appreciate the bar having an interest in wanting to do this, and I would recommend that you continue your history provisions.
We will. Thanks very much.
Thank you.